Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to this episode of Real Talk. Just a couple things to note before we get into today's show. If Real Talk has impacted you, we would love if you would take a minute and leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. This is a huge help for us in promoting Real Talk to those who have never listened. And, as always, today's episode is brought to you by our official sponsor, Trivan, builders of custom trucks, trailers, and enclosure buildings tailored to your needs. Be sure to check them out at www.trivan.com. A huge thanks to them for making this conversation possible. Now on to today's episode. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Real Talk podcast. It's your host Lucas Holtfluer here, bringing you a new episode, an exciting episode on the topic of vocation. What does this word mean? What is our vocation? Do we have multiple vocations? What is our calling? How does this relate to vocation? Is this just the work we do every day? Is this the job we get paid for? Is this the work in our home? So many questions around this topic. And I'm joined today by a returning guest to the show. Last time we chatted about eschatology, and this time we're chatting about his new book called Finding My Vocation, a guide for young people seeking a calling. If you're interested, it looks like this, and you can go grab a copy for yourself. I would highly recommend. But we're going to work through that book today, so I appreciate you coming back and joining us, Pastor Boekestein.
Well, I'm really glad to be with you again, Lucas. Look forward to chatting about something that we all need to think about and really answers the question, what should I do with my life? So it's an important topic, and thanks for having me on.
Wonderful. Okay, well, let's jump right into it then. So I suppose probably where we should start before we get into the contents of the book is, what was the problem you saw out there that you were trying to solve when you wrote this book? Did you, in your work as a pastor, did you have a lot of your parishioners coming to you, especially I would assume younger ones, asking questions about vocation, questions about work, employment? Was there a real need that you sensed out there on this topic?
Yeah, there always has been a need for people to answer the big question about what they're to do with their life. But in the last, probably 10 or 20 years, it's become more acute. We have so many options today. Young people do. They can find job descriptions online, and the fact that we have so many options can actually be crippling to us. We can feel like, well, now there's so many choices. Whereas in earlier generations, especially before industrialization and globalization, you basically didn't have to think too much about options. You probably were going to go into whatever is common in your area. If you worked in a coal mining area, you were likely going to be a coal miner. Or if your father was a farmer, you probably were going to be a farmer. And so we've got so many options today that can be very difficult for young people to navigate. And as well, I think there's an increasing fear of commitment among young people. We see that in relationships in some sense, but we also see it in other big choices. I think there's a fear of entering into a job that I'm going to be chained to for the next 40 or 50 years, as maybe young people look and see their parents or grandparents in the same field, maybe a field that the parent or grandparent has been faithful in, but a young person might look at that and say, well, that doesn't seem like the kind of thing I want to do my entire life for 85% of my waking, the days in the week, and 8 to 10 hours of my waking time. And so I think there's some anxiety that people face today. And really, the doctrine of vocation can help reduce that anxiety and give us clarity in terms of how to spend our time right now, even as we look to a future that to us seems uncertain.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, we should probably start with defining the term, because I think, well, people would probably have a general sense of, okay, what is my vocation, or what does this word mean? I think the definitions could vary from person to person. So how did you come to define this word in your research, and yeah, just how do you define vocation?
Yeah, vocation it sounds a little intimidating. It just comes from the Latin for calling. And so calling and vocation can be used interchangeably as synonyms. And I think 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 17 gives a really good working definition from Scripture. If I could read that a minute. Paul says, "Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which the Lord has called him." And so you have the idea of calling there from God, which is an amazing thought that the God of heaven and earth actually calls me to do something. And it also provides the comfort of God's sovereignty and his providence, because the Lord has assigned to each of us a particular calling. And so really what we're talking about is, how can I, to some extent, find that calling? But more practically, how can I live faithfully in the calling that I have right now, whether as a student or in an entry level job or whatever it is? How can I be faithful because I know the Lord has called me to this right now? And if you were to go on in that chapter, the Apostle Paul gives an example. He says, imagine a slave being called by the Holy Spirit with that effectual call, being made a Christian, and then wonders, now, what do I do with my life? I'm a slave. And he says, well, you can be faithful to God in that very calling. Now, he says, if you can improve your circumstance, if you can gain your freedom, do that. And we could interact with that later. But even in that lowly station, a believing slave could know, I have a calling from God to be faithful. And it's interesting that in Ephesians and Colossians and elsewhere, Paul speaks directly to slaves, and he says, this is how you are to honor your master. And you can actually work to the glory of God in whatever station you're in. So vocation is the life that God has called us to, in which we should walk with uh, confidence and with faithfulness every step of the way.
Okay. So vocation and calling can be used interchangeably. Um, you mentioned here about on page 9 of the book a master vocation, which is to love the Lord supremely and our neighbor as ourselves. So one of the questions I had while reading through the book was, how does my work relate to my vocation? And I kind of mentioned it off the top of the show too, but are we only talking about our main job, our main task every day, or how do our tasks in a family setting or in a church setting
Yeah,
relate to vocation?
those are great questions. And I do think it's helpful to look at our primary calling is to serve God as Christians. And so for example, even in Ephesians chapter 4, Paul says to walk worthy of the calling to which you were called. So you were called to be a child of God first. And that's really liberating, because whatever whatever the particulars of your life may be, you have a primary calling to live before the face of God, to glorify and enjoy him in all that you do. And then the Lord gives us particular callings underneath that primary calling. And so we're really thinking about multiple vocations. I know this book focuses primarily on what we would call an occupation or a job, since that's one of the things that um, young people are tasked to find and to be faithful in. But we have all sorts of callings, right? We have a calling as a neighbor to those around us. We have a calling perhaps as a husband or a wife, or as a son or a daughter, and or we have a calling within our broader uh, community in the country that we live in, to be good citizens or whatever. And um, so your occupation is not the entirety of who you are. It's not the entirety of your walk with the Lord, but it is a big part of it. And so we need to give serious thought. We can't just say, well, I'm a Christian, so therefore I'm going to glorify the Lord in all that I do, and not look at the particulars of what I'm doing. How is what I'm doing, especially in something as big as a job, how is that actually glorifying the Lord? So, called to walk before the Lord faithfully in general, but then how do we do that? And a huge part of how we do that is through our work.
Yeah, that makes sense. I don't know if that gets thought about enough or as often as you would think, maybe in the church circles, and maybe you can expand on that in a minute too. I'm sure in your research, there's little stories at the end of each chapter in this book which show an example of someone who is in their workplace and living out some of the principles described in the chapter. But
And Lucas, I could just touch on that a minute. That
sure,
was was super helpful for me. So I have some work experience outside of being a pastor. I worked on a farm from like the age 12 till 17. Then I went into construction work. I've also been a teacher, but that's fairly limited in addition to the 17 years that I've been a pastor. And so early on in the project, I sent out just a flurry of emails to people around the world, different states in America, and people in different vocations, different seasons of their life. Some just starting at work, some looking back from retirement on what they've been able to do, and basically, especially the older folks, I said, what would you say to your younger self if you now knowing what you do, how would you advise yourself? And so that's been hugely helpful. So I hope those little sketches at the end of each chapter will give young people a sense of, okay, so this is how this person found their calling in a field that I might be interested in. The advice that they gave also is scattered throughout the book. I'm so thankful for all those who contributed to that.
Yeah, that was a really helpful part of the book. I enjoyed that. It just served to really put it into a real life context at the end of reading the chapter. And that's
Mm.
something I appreciate about this book in general is that, um, yes, there's obviously theology inside of it, and all of our principles are scripturally based, but there's a lot of practical advice in this book too. And I think we'll get to that further on in our chat here as well. So people can stay tuned for that. But my question on this was, so people, you mentioned different stages of life, different stages of career, especially when you're young. You mentioned working on the farm, working in construction. A lot of people, you work the jobs that are available,
Mhm.
and you're looking to. I think a lot of people would say, yeah, you're trying to find your career job or the one job you'll stay in for a long
Right.
time. Um, in that search, especially I'm thinking on the younger end of things too, but even later on in life, does is God using that kind of work in a sanctifying aspect, like just by having a job to do and being expected to do it to a certain standard? I often heard growing up, like you do things because it builds character, right?
Yeah,
That's what you say about all the jobs that suck,
that's
and
right.
that's why
Exactly.
that's why you're in the greenhouse, or that's why you're out in the hot roofing, or whatever
Right.
the job is, right? All these tough jobs. Is there a sanctifying aspect to that?
Well, there is. And I would back up even in saying the fact that you have a job is an unbelievable gift from God. And I know it doesn't always feel like that. I mean, I've worked construction on super hot days and very cold days, and it's hard work. And it doesn't always feel like something we're thankful for. But if you think about the story of Scripture, the Lord calls Adam and Eve to work in his garden after having created them in his image, and they were working, uh, cultivating the garden, naming the animals. But when they fell into sin, the Bible says the wages of sin is death, and that should have been that by all accounts should have been the end of any production, any satisfaction that one might enjoy through work, any ability to provide for ourselves or those around us. But the Lord extended mercy and allowed Adam and Eve to continue working. And so um, Michael Berg, in his book on vocation, which is also really wonderful, says that no vocation is beneath us. Every vocation is above us. Every opportunity that we have to work is a gift from God. And so I know that's not going to make it any cooler or more comfortable on those hot days that you're working on the roof or whatever. But we should say this is amazing that the Lord has given me, someone who really deserves only His wrath and only judgment, the opportunity to work and be productive and care for those around me. So I think that's a huge part of a proper outlook on work, is that this is a gift from God, and it is true. Even though I caught a sense of cynicism in your voice when we're told, well, this is character building. It absolutely is true, because how you conduct yourself in these what you might call and this isn't necessarily so, but what you might call lower level jobs or jobs that you're just getting a start in, how you conduct yourself there is going to uh, is sort of charting a course for you for how you're going to conduct yourself later. Most people don't just sort of turn on better character when they get to the job that they feel better suited to. So will you accept those tasks that feel beneath you? Will you do that with joy? Will you love your neighbor as yourself in your work, in the difficult work, in the dirty work? That really is forming who you are. In fact, someone has said that actually we are the product that is most um, uh, being formed in the work that we do. It's us, and so that is absolutely correct. And there's also, when you're in your early working years, you also are um, either taking or not taking opportunities to become more equipped to be in a different position or to be in the same position with different responsibilities. You're listening to advice or you're not. And so character building is absolutely essential. Will you be responsible for yourself in the place that God has you right now? Because if you don't answer that question affirmatively now, how likely is it that you will later?
For sure. Yes, I didn't mean to come across as cynical there. It was a little more tongue in cheek because I totally agree. All those, if I think of my own life, the experiences I had early on, those jobs that you didn't want to do, even when you're young, right? Like I had a paper route, cutting grass. Yeah, you're in the greenhouse, you're roofing, whatever, construction.
Yeah,
You're getting up early, you're setting all those routines, you're just learning how to take orders, how to solve problems,
yeah,
how to work as a team, and these are some of the practicalities you get to later in the book too. But yeah, I 100% agree. It forms who you are later on, and you
yeah.
build good habits and character that way. Okay, in chapter 3, you talked a bit about, or not a bit, the whole chapter's on this. You talked a lot about how our conversion is related to our calling. Can you expand a bit on this and talk about some practical ways that this actually applies?
Yeah, well, it's huge because in a very real sense, you can't have a vocation unless you're converted. And I don't mean that non-Christians do not do valuable work. They absolutely do. I'm so thankful for the work that unbelievers do. Um, uh, to me, if someone does excellent work, I'm a beneficiary of that, whether they're a Christian or not. So I'm so thankful for that. But to have a vocation, you really do need to have a right perspective. You need to do, as the Heidelberg Catechism says, when it asks what is a good work, it's first a work that's done out of faith in God and for His glory, and then also according to His law. And so you don't have a vocation. You're not living for the glory of God in all that you do unless you're a believer. So this is a huge issue theologically and practically as well, because the other thing is when 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 we don't have that primary vocation of living for God, then work can become the thing that we seek justification through. So we feel that we're important and significant and valuable when our work is quality, perhaps, or when it's received well by people, when we're affirmed, when we're appropriately compensated financially. And so what conversion does is it frees us from that quest that will never be realized to sort of justify ourselves by our work, which a lot of people are caught in. Their life is their work, and that cannot satisfy. Nothing in this life is going to give us what we truly need, which is a vital relationship with God and all the blessings that accompany that. So it answers our need for justification. It also activates the motivator of gratitude. When when you realize that God has delivered you from slavery to sin and promised you an eternal inheritance, now you're not working to gain God's favor, but you're working out of God's favor to thank Him and to say, Lord, even my work, even the difficult things I'm going to do today, I'm going to do because I love you because you first loved me, and you've trained me now to love my neighbor. And there's we could go through that whole list, but you can't even work to the glory of God unless the Holy Spirit gives you the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. All the fruit of the Spirit, you need those at work, and you can't have those unless you're converted to Christ. So the 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 calling of God in our ordinary occupations is dependent on our coming to God in Christ through faith.
For sure. I think one quote you had in this chapter that I really liked that speaks to what you just said there was I think it was you're quoting Michael Berg perhaps in this one, but it says, free from striving to satisfy God, quote, my energy is geared toward this life, and if my energy is used in a variety of vocations, then I am always neighbor oriented, focused on others. I look to their interests before mine. And then you go on to describe what that means. But I just think that's so, yeah, like you say, having the faith, the Christian perspective on this, knowing that you are saved, therefore go out and work hard and glorify God in that work and serve your neighbor.
Right.
It's such a positive perspective.
Well, it's something that that believers need to be reminded of, because whether it's my work as a pastor or whatever it is you do, I can get discouraged when the things that I'm trying to do aren't happening. They're not proving to be, at least from my limited perspective, to be effective. And so I need to be regularly reminding myself that my approval from God's approval of me is sealed in the blood of Christ, and I can't become more loved by God than I am right now, no matter how my job goes. And that's what you need, especially on really hard days or hard seasons.
For sure. I think it also balances out the temptation, like you mentioned earlier, on the one side for people to say my work is my life and I'm fully identified through my work, and on the other flip side of things, where people just say, oh, I'm living for the weekend or working for the weekend. A Christian perspective on work kind of balances out those two and helps to keep you grounded. Would you say?
Yeah, absolutely, that's right.
Right. Okay. All right. So, you had three different areas of this book, and I don't know if I actually outlined that properly off the hop, but we had the pondering section, and that's kind of what we just worked through there. Next is the prepare section. How do you prepare for your vocation? And then finally, the last section is how do you practice your vocation? So we've gone through, how do we think about vocation? What are you pondering when you're thinking about vocation? Getting into the prepared section, if I go to page 41 of this book, I think there was a quote that I loved there that I just wanted to share with the audience as well. Page 41 says this at the bottom. Here's the problem. Many people feel entitled to a good life, no matter what they give in exchange. They might assume, often illogically, that they will have a better standard of living than their parents. But many people think too little of what they have to offer the world, what they bring to the bargaining table. Put bluntly, you need to be good at something before you can expect a good job. That's some pretty counter-cultural stuff. What was going through your mind when you were researching this and when you wrote that section?
Well, that last line that you read is a quotation from Cal Newport. He wrote a book a few years ago called "So Good They Can't Ignore You," and so his point is to say, um, by the way, Cal Newport is a good one to read on almost anything he writes, and so his digital minimalism comes up in this book. His deep work comes up in this book. Really, really good thinker on this, and I do think that we find ourselves in in a cultural moment where we feel entitled to the best of life, and part of that comes from the fact that we have a good life, and so many of us were, especially in the West, were just simply born into a good life, and we didn't. I mean, I don't know if you've got grandparents or great grandparents who are immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
They came with probably very little, and they worked very hard to achieve the life that they have. The Lord blessed them richly. It couldn't have done it without the Lord's blessing. But most of us didn't have to do that. We didn't have to scratch and try to eke out a living. And so we come into our working years with a sense of expectation. I'm going to get something good out of my work, but we think too little sometimes about what I'm actually bringing. How am I going to be a blessing to the people that are truly expecting something from me in my work? And so that first chapter in the second section is have something to offer. So bring to the table something good, and I break that down into three parts, having to do with wisdom, or what you know, character, or who you are, and skills, what you can do. So I think if you look at those three areas uh, and prepare in those ways, you're going to have something to offer so that you can actually expect to be rewarded well.
And in the wisdom domain, you mentioned in the book, and I think this is a salient point as well, that the digital revolution that we've seen. I mean, I'm 26 years old, so essentially over my lifetime, I guess.
Mhm.
Many people, and I would totally include myself in this as well, have not thought enough about what that has done to our attention spans.
Right.
And I think you're kind of quoting or paraphrasing a bit of Os Guinness here, but this stood out to me in the book. Due to a careless response to the digital revolution, many Christians are in danger of having minds wrecked by constant distraction and unfamiliar with concentration. That is unwise. I think that's very true, and I think that's something that many people struggle with in today's attention economy. How can we, as Christians, exercise wisdom in this area and build up, and have something to offer from a vocational
Yeah.
standpoint?
Well, I would, Cal Newport in his book Digital Minimalism, he describes the problem of being distracted, and he explains it in a way that we might not always recognize. It feels sort of counterintuitive because we have smart devices that we use all the time, and so we feel pretty smart using those devices. But we didn't develop the code. Most of us didn't develop the code to run those smart devices or know how to build them in a manufacturing sense. We're just on the user end, and so we feel like we're pretty intelligent using these things. But that's often not the case. So it gives us a false sense of knowledge. I've got all this knowledge at my fingertips, right? I can Google anything I want. I can find an entry for anything on Wikipedia. I've got all this information here, but do I actually have wisdom? What do I actually know, and how am I using that? And so Newport lays out in his book a plan for, and it's detailed. I won't go into it now, but for really just living more similarly to how people have lived prior to the digital revolution, not ignoring the tools. There are many good tools that we can use today, but some of these tools are not actually working well for us. And so I found it interesting. I think it was, well, it's in a lot of books, but a lot of people today have researched the Amish in terms of their use of tools in a sort of surprising way. So the people who've done that have concluded the Amish are not anti-technology, they're not anti-progress, but they're very selective in what they'll take on. So he's not recommending that we become Amish. He's saying have a grid that you use to evaluate the tools that come into your life to see if they're actually going to be helpful. Are they going to increase your knowledge? Obviously, a huge part of this is just a reduction of screen time and moving away from skimming and scrolling and getting into deep reading, undistracted time. That's one of the themes in Newport's deep work. Undistracted time of focus. Otherwise, we're just not going to have the mental capacity to be able to do hard problem-solving work because we're become wired for distraction, and that's not going to help us later on in life.
Mm-hmm. I could see where you put that in the wisdom section. That's definitely something to be wise about. You mentioned there's three portions to this have something to offer chapter, and the second one is cultivating that character. And you kind of walk through the second table of God's law to look at some points on that section. Do you want to walk through some of those about authority and life and sexuality and truth and whatnot?
Yeah, so the second table of the Ten Commandments is absolutely about our character. It's how do you love God by loving your neighbor? That is your character. And the fifth commandment, for example, the starting point of the second table is all about authority. So it starts out sounding like it's just a family situation, honor your father and your mother, but we should look at that command as the Lord's will for us to develop a sense of proper respect for authority in all of life. And so it applies this command to our relationship to all of our superiors. And so the reality is, and I've been saying this for years, I think if you look at people later in life who are not doing well, not respecting their bosses, not respecting the law, not understanding why the boss can leave on the weekends and you have to work on the weekend, it's probably because you have not learned that uh, that character trait of respecting authority in your younger years. And so it's, in a certain sense, it's never too late, but we have to learn to respect authority because nobody in this world is above authority. No matter how high you climb in that corporate ladder, you're always going to be answering to someone. And so how you respect authority is a huge part of who you are in the workplace. And then you can just go right on through those commands, Lucas. You think about the sixth commandment, which forbids murder in its most obvious application. But the Heidelberg Catechism applies that and says, no, it's not just don't murder, it's love your neighbor, show patience and peace and meekness and so on. And so when you're working, you're 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 actually called to be an anti-murderer. You're actually called to promote the life of the people around you. How can I best serve this customer? How can I make an excellent product? How can I, as a checkout cashier or whatever it is, be a blessing to this person in my work? How can I help them to walk away from this encounter in a way that says, I feel more alive than I did before I met this person? And so you respect life. And then moving on to the seventh commandment, which on the face of it is seems to be just about adultery. You do not commit adultery, but it's really promoting healthy, godly, biblical sexuality. And I think all of us, it doesn't take long to be in the workplace before you realize the workplace is a dangerous place sexually in terms of attitudes and comments and the way that one might disrespect someone of the opposite sex, for example. And so your character is, how am I going to help this person be to flourish better as a man or as a woman, even in my when I say sexual interaction with them, I don't mean in an illicit way, but um, as a sexual person, which every one of us is. How do I honor the sexuality of people around me in my on my team or with the people that I work with? Um, the eighth commandment is clearly about forbidding theft, but it actually says something positive. How do I pursue my calling in such a way, as Paul says in Ephesians chapter 4, that I am no longer stealing, but actually have something to share with those around me? Um, I think you and I both were not raised in the Westminster tradition, but the Westminster catechisms actually uh, apply the eighth commandment by saying you must procure wealth. You must have something to share with someone. Otherwise, you're going to be like the person in the book of James whom he condemns, who sees a poor person and says, "Be well and well fed and well clothed," but has nothing to offer. And so this is just one of the fruits of vocation, that we gain something to offer. And you could go through the others as well. But if you look at the Ten Commandments, especially the second table, they are about forming our character to be able to excel in the vocations that God has given to us.
Wonderful. Thank you. That definitely helps make it a lot more tangible in terms of what we're looking at there in the character cultivation. The final piece of this puzzle for having something to offer is that developing skills section. Now, this one's pretty interesting. This is, I think, very much practical advice, and you kind of lay out four different skill sets you feel that would do people well to develop in order to have something to offer. And I'll just list them out, and then you can kind of interact with them as you'd like. Number one was learn to speak well. Number two was learn to solve problems. Three was learn to work with a team. And then four was develop manual or mechanical skills. Floor is yours on these.
Sure. Well, those are just four things that I mean, many more could be added to those things. But what I'm trying to do in this chapter, I know I can't go into everybody's particular field and say these are the skills that you need to develop in your particular field to excel. I mean, obviously, if you're going into welding, you need to develop the skill of welding. You need to understand the different gases and how to just lay a good line. But no matter what you're in, these are four things that are gonna help you, the skills that you need. So the first is communication. So whether that's speaking or writing, we have to learn to communicate. And this is actually one of those things that can set you apart from people that you might be competing with for a job or for a promotion, even if they are superior to you in some other skills. Good communicators almost always advance. And so I know this is the thing that we often least want to do, but I encourage readers to take opportunities to hone your public speaking skills. When you're writing that email, make sure that it works grammatically. Make sure that you're presenting yourself as best you can. Um, and so, learn to ask good questions. I have a friend who just started on a job and was really struggling at first. He wasn't going on to the next thing that was expected of him because he didn't know what to do next. And so I encourage him, communicate, ask your superior, what should I do next? Be proactive in your communication. So communicating is huge. And then the second thing that I interact with is solving problems. And you what you find in work is that essentially all of work, much of work at least, is a series of problem solving. And so that's one of the things that you actually learn in your elementary years or your middle school years, your high school years. One of the benefits of school, even for those who, and I would encourage those who think, well, I'm just going to go into a trade, or I'm not going to go to college or university, so my academic performance in the younger years isn't that important. One of the many reasons it is important is because you're learning to solve problems. You may not be interested in Shakespearean literature, for example, but the discipline of reading those poems or understanding the play and explaining what's going on here, that is forming a skill for you to solve problems, to work through something hard. It could be true whether it's math and you're not gifted in math. Learn that algebra, not because you're going to necessarily apply it specifically unless you're an engineer or something like that, but the discipline of solving problems is going to take you a long way in your working years. And then teamwork. um, we've all worked with people who really struggle to work as a team, and that's going to set them back. And so uh, teamwork is literally it should be one of those obvious uh, applications of the fruit of the spirit, because Paul says, learn to be at peace with everyone as much as within you lies. How can I be a real contributor? How do I make sure that as a team player, I'm not relying on others to do the work that I should be doing myself? How am I being a contributor? And then the last thing I mentioned, again, many more could be added here, but and I think this is especially for those who are not thinking about going into a trade. We still need to be useful with our hands, and so learning skills that enable us to actually leave a mark on the world, to make something, to produce something, to know how to fix things is very valuable. So these are just basic things, but we want to be in our whole person as well developed as we can so that we can be productive and helpful in our working years.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for that. I think it's such an encouragement to see that there too. Well, I mean, speaking as a younger person on that end of things too, just to know that, like, yeah, there's a, even if you don't know where your path is, if you're listening to this and you're like, oh, what am I gonna do? I don't know what my calling is. You can start today and to work on some of these skill sets, because they will serve you well in any area of life. Yeah, I like that you mentioned writing as well, in that speaking section too. I think the communication piece is just, that's so key. It almost goes without saying, but it really doesn't. It should be said. That would be good communication to say it, I suppose. But it's so important in any role that you have. So that was nice to see that there. I remember, I don't know if you follow Jordan Peterson at all, but I remember a couple years back, probably like when I was like 2021, seeing him speak along these lines too, and saying, like, good communication, like learn to speak, learn to write, become articulate. That will take you so far.
Yeah,
And
and Lucas, he's right in saying become articulate, because
yeah,
some people are naturally gifted with articulation, but most of us aren't. Most of us need to practice,
yeah,
practice, practice, practice. Take opportunities that you don't want to take, that you want to say no to, that you're scared to do.
yeah,
Take those, and I can just see that. I mean, that's a reality in my life. I don't I consider myself needing a lot of growth yet in the area of communication. But when I was in high school, I couldn't give a speech. I mean, I remember one time in I think a sociology class, I got up to give a speech. It was my turn to give the speech. I stand up in front of the class. I've got my paper, my notes in front of me, and I start reading the first couple sentences, and I'm so panicked that I totally lose my breath. I can't breathe anymore, and not caring about my grade, I just I just crinkled up the piece of paper, threw it in the trash, and went back and sat down. That was it. I wasn't going to press on. And and so it's and so even when I first started in the ministry, I did not want to preach my first sermon. I was so nervous about it. And thankfully, the my mentor, who was overseeing my internship at the time, he said, well, we're going to get you in the pulpit in a month or whatever it was. And I fought him and I fought him. I said, no, I don't want to do that. But you have to do that. You have to get in front of people. You have to start communicating. And it's not going to go great the first time, maybe, but you just keep working at it and keep practicing. And the Lord will respect that effort, and the Lord will give you, he specifically talks about giving his disciples the ability to say what needs to be said when you put yourself in a place where you're willing to speak. And so, yeah, communication is vital.
For sure. I mean, that's what this podcast kind of started out as too. When Tyler and I started it, not that it was we need to get more articulate necessarily, although I think that was probably in the back of our minds. But I've seen the growth over 4 and a bit years of doing this too. Like if I go back and look at episode 1, it's it makes you blush. It's not good, but
Yeah, no,
you
you're
get you
you're
get further
exactly
down the
right.
road, and
And I
if
and
we
I would
make it.
add to that, Lucas, that doing just that, watching yourself speak, if you have that opportunity. Now, this isn't gonna be as applicable for everybody, but if you watch yourself or listen to yourself and just muscle through it, because you're not gonna want it. You're gonna want to turn that tape off immediately, but just work through it and say, okay, I see how I'm coming off. I didn't mean to come off that way, but I just need to make some slow but steady growth in that area, and you will see that. And it's interesting. I think a lot of pastors felt that during COVID, where they're now thrust in front of a camera where they didn't necessarily want to be for a lot of uh, services where you couldn't meet in person, and you see yourself and you come off a lot more wooden than you expect. And so you gotta do that. You gotta watch yourself, listen to yourself, and just take note.
Yep. Oh, that's true. You mentioned a little later on in this section too. There's a paragraph about fulfilling your duties in small responsibilities can help you figure out where to point your gifts vocationally, and that's kind of along the same lines too. Of just do it, just get out there, try it, and you'll layer these things. I've found that to be true in my work. Like Tyler, my co-host, and I, we run a small business together in the construction supply business, supplying doors. And yeah, there's just, as an entrepreneur, you find a way to make new mistakes every day, but you go, oh, okay, that didn't work. Well, but I like this piece of it, so I'm going to build on that, and I'll do that with this customer next time. And it's
Yeah.
just this whole succession of learning and growing. And yeah, it sounds cheesy, but like you just find a way to get better every day. And it's a really, I find it rewarding and fun, because it's just you're layering on skills, and all of a sudden you look back, you're like, oh wow, I never would have done what I'm doing today
Right.
3 years ago. And
Yeah,
that's just a result of practicing, which you talk about a lot in the
that's
book
right.
too.
And another thing that I don't think I mentioned in the book, but I think a huge part of the communication piece is to read good writers,
Mm,
and to
hmm.
listen to good writers. So I listen to a lot of audiobooks, and I think I mean, it's practical because you can often kill two birds with one stone. But I think listening to how others communicate, especially if it's a good reader,
Yep.
um, that's a huge help. Wow, how he put that phrase or how he articulated that, really helpful. Yeah, and the other thing I remember learning in seminary was Dr. Beakey said to us, um, in your reading life, try to always be reading something that's above your reading level, and then sometimes read things that are at your level, and sometimes read things that are below your reading level. And all of those are going to bring different things to your ability to communicate. I think especially the advice of reading things above or below your reading level is huge. We sometimes leave behind uh, like young adult literature or children's literature, but the best children's literature, young adult literature, is really good communication. And so if you read C.S. Lewis, for example, as he's writing to young people, that's just really, really good communication. So the stuff that you read, the stuff that you listen to is gonna mold how you talk in time, even if you don't notice it.
Totally. Even just I have two young daughters. So my one daughter is, well, she's only about 17 months. So we're kind of getting into the read the storybook stage a lot now, and just reading simple children's stories out, just practicing that reading out loud.
Yeah,
That helps a ton too, I find,
yeah.
for sure. Okay, you talked about ambition in this section of the book as well. Um, Speaking personally, I like the word ambition, but I think a lot of people would say, ambition is not good. Like you can be too ambitious, and you got to watch out for that. Um, how do we have proper ambition as Christians, and how does that tie into our vocation?
Yeah, well, this is a little tricky because ambition in the older sense of the word had mostly negative connotations. And so an ambitious person, sort of by definition, was someone who was always grasping for more and was never satisfied and always wanted to achieve more to draw attention to themselves or because they had a love of money or whatever. And so that's not how we should be thinking about ambition. But what is the opposite of ambition? If you think about that, we certainly don't want to be that either, right? I mean, you could say, yes, part of the opposite of ambition is contentedness, and that's true. We should be content, but we shouldn't become complacent. We certainly shouldn't be lazy. We shouldn't settle for, well, that work that I did is okay, and that's fine. And so ambition um, is having an aim for quality and excellence and striving for that, even though you know you're not going to hit your goal. So you have high goals, you aim high, you recognize that I'm going to fall short, but if you're going to fall short of something, let it be something that's noble and something that if you hit the mark would be unbelievable. And so I think that's the proper kind of ambition. Uh, God is worthy of our very best, and we shouldn't give him, subpar work, and we shouldn't give our neighbor subpar work because our neighbor is worthy of our true love and the kind of love that you would give to someone very close to you. If you did a job, for example, as in construction, putting in doors, and if you were working for a family member or a close friend or something, you would want to make sure they were completely satisfied with what you did. And of course, you'll want to take, I'm sure you do, you want to take that same attitude to all of your customers. Nobody's a second class customer. They're all valuable, and you should leave them with a sense, wow, he brought everything and did exactly what he said he was going to do. And that's ambition in a proper sense.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree. You talked about being realistic later on in this chapter as well, which is always helpful advice when you're talking about your career and vocation. In that section, the idea of passion comes up versus what are you actually able to do? What is your skill set? How does your passion align with your skill set? Before reading this book, I would have thought, yeah, I think you work hard, you develop your skill set, and then your passion comes in after the fact. I think I still agree with that, but I'm curious what you think on that topic.
Well, I largely agree with that too, Lucas. I think the modern paradigm is that you should combine your passions and your skills for rewarding work, and then that's true to some extent. And if that's possible, that's wonderful. Some people, I've got a cousin who, from a very young age, he was passionate about going into the military. He was going to go to West Point, and he did. He set his sights on that, and he achieved it. And he's still in the military 25 years later, and very passionate about it, I believe. And that's wonderful. But it can be dangerous as well because, as I mentioned in the book, some of our passions, especially when we're young, aren't realistic, right? The things that you dreamed about doing as a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, those are wonderful things, being an astronaut or whatever it is. But you start looking at the statistics of how many people can actually become an astronaut. You do have to be realistic, and so I would never want, especially as parents, to discourage our children from pursuing the things that they love within reason. But I think you also have to give them good advice. Good, well-researched advice. And some of the things that you're passionate about when you're little, you're not going to be passionate about later. And so you don't have to worry about following your dreams or chasing your passions. And I do agree with what you said as well, that a lot of times passion comes with competence and experience and um, recognition. And I don't mean that in a way that strokes our pride, but when people start realizing that what you're doing is valuable and good, you become more passionate about that. And so I just want to encourage young people who may be listening to this that um, you do have to be patient in realizing some of the dreams or some of the desire that you have for your work. Um, but you will get to a point, if you work hard and are diligent and follow good advice, you'll get to a point where you say, "Wow, I love what I do." And I don't
Mm-hmm.
think I loved what I did when I was first starting out at it. Now, partly it's because you have you're not in the same place. You're not the lugger on the job site. You're designing plans now, or you're talking to customers about how to build a house that they're excited about, or whatever it is. And but that usually happens in time and not immediately. And that's one of the other hazards that young people face today, is that we not only have a tendency of feeling entitled, but also want to have our expectations realized right now. And that's something that we're used to. You don't have to wait usually for a letter to arrive 3 or 4 days after somebody sent it to you. They'll send you an email or a text and you'll have it instantly. And so there's this instant communication. Um, and so, and that's true in a lot of other areas as well. But it's not true usually in vocation. It does take some time to become good at what you're doing, so that you can actually say, wow, this is valuable, this is good. People appreciate what I'm doing. The Lord is blessing my efforts, and I love what I do. I mean, go back to the illustration I gave a moment ago. I could never have imagined when I was in high school that I'd basically be giving 2 or 3 speeches every single week, in front of dozens or hundreds of people. That never would have been a passion that I would have pursued. But with the Lord's blessing and with the progress and the work at it, I can't imagine now doing anything else. I absolutely love what I do, and but that did take some time to get to that point.
Mm-hmm. Actually, a quick little offshoot on that topic, because I was going to ask you, yeah, for yourself personally, okay, you feel like I think it's fair to say that I get the sense that you love what you do nowadays.
I
Um,
do.
but coming into the ministry, you often hear like the ministry is a calling. That's a vocation from the Lord, right? It's supposed to be a lifetime calling, in many cases. Um, did you find that for yourself in your research there? Is there any reason for people to delineate between the vocation or the calling of a minister and the vocation and calling of someone in their job? Because, like, I'll use my own example. Am I going to be a small business owner or a door salesman entrepreneur for the rest of my life? Maybe. I like what I do every day. I enjoy it. It's sustainable for sure. But also, I might change jobs at some point. You never know. Um, is it on the same level, or is there a little bit of a difference there?
Well, there is a difference there. I'll say, first of all, there's a general difference. Um, some 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 vocations you just cannot succeed in unless you love it, unless you are certain that you're called to this thing. And it's not just the ministry. I mean, I think of people who, for example, like hospice nurses, people who deal with dying people every single day. I do think you have to really believe you're called to that and love what you're doing, or missionaries, or uh, people who work in prisons, or just the things that really you couldn't do well if you didn't say, I think this is what I need to be doing. And that's especially true for the ministry. In fact, Paul says in 1 Timothy chapter 3 that he who desires the work of a bishop desires a good thing, or the calling of a bishop or a pastor, an elder. And so there actually there's a required desire component there. You would not be a good minister or even a good elder or deacon if you didn't have some desire to do that thing. But of course, desire isn't enough. So because the work of the ministry is, and this is, by the way, why I save my treatment of the potential of being called to the ministry until the very end, because it's really not my focus in this book. The focus in the book is everything else, which I think has been denigrated for too long as being not a special calling. every
Hmm.
calling you have is special, but the ministry is unique. You have to first desire it. You have to also be recognized. Um, so you can't just declare yourself to be a minister, right? You could declare yourself to be a carpenter and just open the business and say, I'm installing doors now. And you didn't have to check with anybody or get confirmation from anyone. You just did it, and that's good. That's entrepreneurial. But we're not the Lord is not looking for entrepreneurial people in ministry who just declare themselves to be a minister. And so there's a sign of ordination in which the church recognizes a person's passion and competency and pairs that person with an actual call. And so there is a difference, but I do think it's an important thing to consider in a book like this, because when I was younger, I had no idea how a person became a minister. I just didn't know. It was a very mysterious thing. And I don't think that's healthy for the church to not know how ministers are raised up. Ministers are really ordinary people, who probably could have been useful to society in any number of other fields. And I think I may mention that in the book, that if you're the kind of person that probably couldn't be useful in anything else, you're probably not going to be that useful in the ministry. And so um, I didn't know how this worked. And so I think the church needs to know these are ordinary men. The Lord has a calling on their life that the church can't know authoritatively, especially early on. But these ordinary men are encouraged, they're prayed for, they're mentored. And so I just want to encourage. Uh, I mentioned in the book, William Perkins says, he's a Puritan who wrote on vocation, mentions that every parent should strive to designate at least one of their young men to be in the ministry. Now, that's a little ambitious. I don't think we probably don't even have, at least presently, the need for that many ministers. But parents should be thinking, is there a possibility that my son is called to the ministry? And at least encourage them to ask those questions, because I never thought about that, especially in my high school years. So there is a difference, but some of the same things are absolutely applicable. Um, my friend David Bonson's new book, Full Time, it's a wonderful book through and through, but he's quite negative about pastors. Not because he doesn't love the ministry. He's a churchman. He loves the church. He loves pastors. But he mentions at one place in the book, one of the reasons you don't hear a lot of sermons about work in his observation is because many ministers themselves do not have a good work ethic. And so how do you preach about work sincerely when you don't work well? And so ministers need to have some of the same kinds of things that we've talked about already in this podcast: diligence and resolution to do the very best that they can, honing their craft. And so it's different, but a lot of the same things would still apply.
Hmm. For sure. I like that point, especially about, yeah, you can't just fail into the ministry. This
Mm-hmm.
isn't a last resort stop. It's such a high bar. So that was helpful. I appreciate that. I think I understand the difference quite well now. Okay, so we're good. There's so much to talk about in this book, and I'm just trying to piece through the ones we want to hit to make sure we're not going on for like a Joe Rogan 3 hour
Yeah,
podcast here,
right.
because that easily could happen. I think one thing I just want to quickly touch on was, to put this in perspective. We talked a little earlier about tech and being distracted, and that's a challenge nowadays too. But also just to keep in mind that the sheer amount of options we have, career-wise today is just, it's ridiculous compared to the historical perspective. And yeah, I think you kind of give that advice in the book too. Like, ultimately, just try something, do it, work, use the responsibilities that are out there, take the small ones, and just find your path as you go. It's God can use you wherever you end up, with
Yeah,
some
that's right. And
caveats maybe.
the idea of options, we should view that as a good thing with some
Mm,
hurdles. I mean, the
yeah,
fact that you are, as a young person, bewildered by the number of options is a signal to you that you live in an amazing place and an amazing time, because
yeah,
so many people around the world don't even know the word option. They just do what they have to do. And so the fact that you've got options is wonderful. So don't lament that. Praise God for that. And second, recognize that, just as I mentioned a moment ago about the ministry, you could probably do a lot of things well, right? I mean, you know, a pastor, for example, or a person who thought he was going to go into the ministry, but for whatever reason never got a call, he could probably work well in another communication industry, or writing for another business or something like that. So this is how we don't want to look at options. We don't want to say, well, there's a needle hidden somewhere in this haystack that is my vocation. It's this secret thing that God has called me to, and I have to find that thing. And that's sort of how I thought about life when I was younger, and it wasn't the right perspective. Had a sort of negative view of providence, that I was going to choose the wrong thing because I don't know all the factors. I'm going to get something wrong, and I'm going to end up somewhere that I never wanted to be. And that's not how providence should work in the life of a Christian. And so think about it this way: the Lord has assigned a place to you. You don't necessarily have to find that. The Lord will get you there. You have to be faithful along the way. And so, just like when it comes to similar, I should say, to finding a spouse, there's not some one person out there that you need to sort of somehow find among 8 billion people in the world. You just need to, you have certain criteria, right? Needs to be a believer, needs to be a faithful church member, needs to have similar views on important doctrines. That's really the sort of grid that you're going to look at when it comes to work. I have to be reasonably paired with my skills, my opportunities. Um, you talk to other people, you ask for advice, you find out what options are out there, what options are in high demand, what what options you could go into with your financial situation, whether you need schooling or whatever. And so don't be intimidated by options. Know them, but then know yourself, listen to other people, and the Lord will bring you into something good.
Agreed, agreed. And he'll use ordinary means to do that too. It's not, like you say, it's not this mysterious needle in a haystack.
That's right. And so I would say, and I do deal with this in the book, but actually, faithful church membership is one of the main things that is going to help you find a vocation. Not because your pastor is necessarily going to be talking about work, though he should from time to time, or that you're going to have job postings in the narthex or whatever, but because you're going to learn there how to understand the will of God, and how to be faithful in following it. You're going even Not every sermon is going to be about work, but every sermon is going to help you think like God to be able to make good decisions. And so just being a faithful church member is one of the best things that you can do to become a faithful and satisfied worker.
Agreed. Okay, towards the end of this section on preparing, you talked about a couple other vocations outside of our main occupation. One of those was gender, and the different callings that each gender has in this world. Do you want to talk to that point a bit, because it's obviously at odds with what the culture tells us and this
Yeah,
egalitarian age that we live in?
I do. And I think this is an important section. It's a little bit difficult because um, the main thing that I want to say in this section is basically just recognize that you're a man, if you're a man, and think that through as you go into your various vocations, or recognize that you're a woman if you're a woman. Think about that as you go into your various vocations. There's no way that I could apply that reality to every possible vocation. But the main point, as you mentioned, Lucas, in our culture is that as gender differences are being minimized, we're not even thinking. We're tempted to no longer think about our gender as indicating our calling, but it absolutely is. And so, how does that work on a particular job? Well, that's going to be highly nuanced. That's going to be difficult. But certainly, if I go back to uh, something that John Piper wrote in his book on biblical manhood and womanhood, I am to lead and provide for and protect women in the various relationships that I have with them. Now that's going to look different with my wife and my daughters than it will with my neighbor who's a woman, or the girls that my daughters spend time with. But it doesn't cancel my calling to be manly toward the women in my life, providing, protecting, leading, serving. Um, and the same thing with women. A woman is called to receive and nurture godly leadership in her various relationships with men. Certainly not in the same way as she would with her husband or with her sons or with her own elders at church, but she's to be a woman in her work. And so, yeah, this is a tricky section, isn't it? Because in some traditions, you're going to have maybe a more narrow view of what a woman should do uh, outside of the home, for example. And in other settings, you're going to have a much broader view. But whatever your particular approach is in your society or in your church or in your family, you have to recognize that your gender is absolutely part of your calling, and you can't neglect that.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. And without getting too far in the weeds on that one, I guess we can maybe transition a little bit into family, which is of course related to the role of male and female. But the quote you have here, and you were quoting someone else in this section here, is the primary estate and the site of our most important earthly vocations is the family.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we talked a lot about work. We talked about bringing your gender into your vocation and what that means, and then these last two here are family and church. Um, do you have any advice for people as they seek a place in their life for their occupation, to find the occupation that is quote unquote for them, so to speak? How to balance those commitments? Because I think, especially, like, I'll speak for myself as a guy in his mid 20s, who's found an occupation that's meaningful and want to stay in a long time. Um, that comes with a lot of its own requirements. And then to also be aware, like reading a book like this, thinking about my other vocations as well. Do you have any advice for principles on how to balance the family commitments and as well the church commitments too? Because I find the family one is a little easier because okay, you're with your family every day. You're like, yes, I need to make sure I spend time with my wife and time with my children, and that's easier to do. But I think the rub really comes on the church side of things, where it's like, okay, yeah, I can help out at church, or yes, I should get to this Bible study, or yeah, okay, what would it take to help teach at Sunday school or to teach catechism or any other way to be involved, right? Any advice in that category?
Yeah, so I think it's helpful to recognize that certain things are required of believers and other things are options for believers. And so what is not an option is to be a faithful member of a Bible believing church. And so that is essential. And that should guide you in your choice of a career, or as you're thinking about a potential career move or even moving away for college. One of the first questions you should ask is, how can I be a faithful member in a Bible believing church? And no opportunity should be so appealing that would make you say, well, for the next 3 years, I'm not going to be part of a faithful church. But the goal is I'm going to get back to a good church somewhere after I finish university. You're going to be someone different after those 3 years of not being with the people of God. And so being a faithful member of a Bible believing church is essential. So regular worship on the Lord's Day is non-negotiable. And I think that's the most important thing you can do in life, not just for your vocation, not just for your family, but in life. When God's people are called to worship, you are there. And that should just be ingrained in us. Now, some of the other things that you mentioned, being a Sunday school teacher or attending a midweek study or whatever else, those may be wonderful options. You absolutely have to be using your gifts in the church as Scripture requires, but how to use those and when to use those and how much to use those, Scripture doesn't spell out exactly. Take the opportunities that you believe the Lord is leading you into, absolutely, but prioritize your church life. And I would say that especially to young people, when you get into your your 20s and a little bit beyond that, you are in a bit of a no man's land. At least you feel like you're in a no man's land, because prior to that age, you were under the the mentoring of your parents. Your parents made you go to church, probably, didn't they, Lucas, when you were younger? You
Oh
didn't
yes.
decide that,
Yeah.
right? But when you're in your 20s, especially if you move out, or maybe your folks just say, well, you're 18 now, you got to make decisions for yourself. That's a place where you have to say, well, I'm actually an adult, right? And so I need to make adult decisions spiritually as well. Paul says, when I was a child, I talked and spoke and thought like a child, but I got to put those childish ways behind me. And so I need to find my place in the church, just like you're trying to find your place in some of the great economies of the world. You need to find your place in the church. How do I, as a young person, demonstrate that I no longer need my parents to speak for me, to take me to church, or to require me to volunteer or whatever, but I'm going to do this because I am a mature follower of Jesus Christ. And that's how you're going to be shaped to be a better husband or wife, better father, a better worker. And it's how you're going to learn to walk before the face of God in all of life. And so, um, church life for people in their 20s. That age, it's kind of make or break for a lot of people, right? A lot of people turn away from the church when they get into that age. They've got other priorities, other things that are important. You are going to end up in a place that is so far from where God wants you if you're not committed to the church. So that's vital. It's absolutely vital.
Agreed. Okay. That's helpful. Thank you. We'll shift to the final section here, which is about practice. Um, yeah, one theme that definitely stood out early in this section was the call to do excellent work for God's glory. The quote I have here is, "Your work habits can either validate or undermine your claim of faith and repentance." Now, this might strike at the heart of some people listening, perhaps, but because it seems like a strong statement. But do you feel like this is commonly understood, that we need to do excellent work and we can't just be satisfied with mediocre performance?
Well, I don't think it's common enough. Um, and I've mentioned some statistics that back that up. A lot of people feel like, well, I'm kind of doing my employer a favor by even having this job. The fact that I show up is a pretty big deal. And, I'm underpaid, I'm underappreciated. The thing I do isn't all that important anyway. So the way I do it isn't important. But Paul says, remember, you serve the Lord Christ. And he's speaking to servants there. He's speaking to people who are very much looked down upon in their work, who have very little freedom, who are not compensated appropriately. And yet he says you're working for Christ. And so that's a fundamental shift, that if you're not just working for your neighbor, you are doing that. So you should love your neighbor as you would love yourself. How would I want someone to work for me? That's how we should answer the question. But more than that, you're working for Christ. And so you need to bring excellence to everything that you do.
Agreed. Um, One interesting little sidetrack, rabbit trail note I found here about AI on page 83. I thought that was kind of an interesting perspective that I think people may want to consider, in the fact that AI cannot provide love. Obviously, I'm just quoting here, and you're quoting, I believe it's Douglas Sherman, and he says, "There remains one thing that only human beings are able to create and share with one another: love. If you don't love, you fail the test of vocation. If you are excellent at the technical side of your calling, or efficient in the execution of your tasks, or an effective manager of people, but have not love, you are nothing. Without love, vocation and its potential bestowal of meaning and purpose devolve into a hodgepodge of disjointed tasks." That's yeah. I just thought that was an interesting point. And when's your next book on AI coming out?
That's pretty far out of my area of expertise.
Yeah.
But as I was thinking about this, I've talked to several young people recently who have expressed anxiety over how AI might affect their vocation. Or one young person I talked to who's in college right now, preparing for something that seems like AI could have a powerful impact on. And so this is really an important realization. Yeah, just like all technology has modified the industries that they affect over the years, um, they've also given opportunities for people to show what a machine can't do. And so you know, whatever machine you're working with, whether it's a tractor or whether it's an airplane or whether it's AI, there's going to be some level of human interaction, and that interaction that you demonstrate is going to be an aroma of life or an aroma of death, as Paul says. And so, how do you, in one sense, you could say, how do you distinguish yourself from the machine that is able to do the work in some ways better, but in some ways uh, totally lacking what a human can bring to a job? And so, um, yeah, you can apply this to all kinds of things. You've got robotic vacuums now that can do cleaning in people's homes, but maybe if you're a cleaner in a person's home, how do you show that you're different than that machine? How do you bring life to the people you're working with? So yeah, you boil down the whole law of God into one word, as the Apostle Paul says. That word is love. You love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. You love your neighbor as yourself. And that is not talking about when you're in church or when you're doing, spiritual feeling things. It's all of life. You're loving the Lord, loving your neighbor. And love is partly an attitude. It's partly an emotion. It's partly something that people can feel and sense, a warmth. Uh, but it's certainly more than that. It's the actions that you take toward them. How are you affirming their life by your actions? How are you protecting their property and their interest by your actions? Um, I was talking with David Bonson a few months ago, and he said something like, I could be a real loving and wonderful guy as a financial broker, but people actually want me to take good care of their money. And so, that's part of love. So part of how he loves his neighbor as uh, as one who has financial interest in their life is by making sure as best he can that their money does what they want it to do. And so that's love. So doing your work well is part of how you love the person. Included in that, of course, is how you interact with them, speaking truth lovingly and all the rest. So attitude, actions that reflect the love of God in the lives of other people. That's how we do our vocations best.
Mm-hmm. I think as Christians, if we think about work as service to others, ultimately for the glory of God, while we can be aware of the AI revolution and whatnot, I don't think we need to worry about it too much. It will change a lot of things for sure, but if the focus is on service to other people, yes, as you say, service is through doing an excellent job at whatever the technical task is, but that human element, I don't think can ever fully be replaced of love. So if we love people through our service, through our work, I think we'll be okay. Although the form of the job may change a bit. Okay, we're running tight up against the clock, and I know I want to respect your time here. Um, of course, thinking about work, and as we've been talking about this the whole time, the flip side of that, of course, is rest, and you kind of get into that in chapter 8. So, do you want to describe briefly maybe what a theology of rest is, and then get into some of the principles for how that applies both in a daily cycle and also the weekly rest observed typically on Sunday?
Yeah. Rest is essential. Of course, we all know that. You know what it's like to wake up on a day that you didn't sleep the night before. It's hard to do your job. So there's a basic sense in which we just recognize it. But we should also see rest as a gift from the Lord. He said that we should work 6 days, and the seventh day we should rest. And the Lord gifts that to us for our spiritual good as well as for our physical good. And so rest is a gift and a responsibility that we need to steward. And so it's a recognition that God knows that we're frail, knows that we're dust, knows that we cannot work nonstop. We're not machines, which of course also need maintenance and probably some downtime here and there. But so we have to believe in rest. We have to recognize that God wants us to be producers There is a creation mandate to cultivate the earth, to exercise dominion over the earth, to rule over that. But to do that well, we have to rest. And God has built a schedule into the fabric of our lives with the Lord's Day, which I'm sure says more than that we should rest every seventh day, but it certainly doesn't say less than that. And so we need to take the Lord's Day seriously, day of rest. And so you take the theology that the Lord is omnipotent, he's all powerful. He didn't need to rest the seventh day. He did to model for us the importance of it because we're not omnipotent. We're very limited. And so I apply that in two ways. You need a rhythm of rest, but then you also need quality of rest. So the rhythm of rest is, I think, most obviously the Lord's Day. You truly rest so that you can worship, so that you can rest from your sins, so that you can be a receiver instead of a producer. If you're only producing, only feel like you're filling needs, you're going to have a different view of yourself than you ought. You take one day to say the Lord is going to take care of me. I'm not going to work. Just like when the Lord promised manna to his people, he said during the 6 days that the manna is on the ground, you're going to go out and gather it. You're going to work. And then the seventh day, you're not going to gather anymore. You're just going to receive. And then I'll preserve that food for you so that it'll be there when you need it. So we need weekly rest. We also need daily rest. And of course, there are seasons in life where real workers recognize there's not going to be too much rest. One of my brothers is a dairy farmer and they're chopping corn right now. And he's going to put in long hours and it's going to be for weeks. And he's going to show up and he's going to do his best every single day. And he's going to be super tired and dirty when he gets home. He's going to wake up the next morning, he's going to do it again. That's what it requires right now. But he can't work like that his whole year, his whole career. And so, but the same thing in the ministry, same thing in your life. There are busy seasons, but even in busy seasons, you do have to think about rest, um, daily rest, saying no to your work, stopping. Cal Newport. I know I keep mentioning him, but his book Deep Work was so helpful to me. Um, he says, he's a professor at Georgetown University, very well respected, has a lot of peer reviewed papers. He says, I do no work after 5 p.m. I work super hard in concentration up to that time. And then I take a break so I can recharge, develop greater creativity, spend time with my family, of course. So daily rest. But then the other thing that we often forget is you need quality rest. And so what I'm focusing on in that section is really our leisure time. And I want to develop a sort of vocational sense of leisure. And that's super important right now because in some ways our leisure time is in danger of being hijacked by players in the attention economy. You if you don't plan for your downtime, it's already planned for you. You've got something that you could binge watch, you've got some device that you could scroll through, and you could burn an hour where you could have been refreshing and renewing. And you get through the hour, you don't even know what you did. I mean, you don't even know what you viewed. You couldn't say to a single person, this is what I've learned, this is what I've observed. You might remember one meme from an hour of scrolling. Uh, that's not quality rest. And so what I'm trying to do in this section is apply some of the same disciplines, specifically as Kent Hughes calls it, the discipline of refusal, saying no to things that aren't best for you so that you can say yes to other things. And so that's going to require an element of planning. So you're going to say, well, tonight I'm probably going to be home from work at 5 o'clock. Um, let's see what I can do. Let's see what we can do as a family. We're going to have dinner. And then afterwards, that's going to mean something different for every person. But you want your rest to be refreshing, to actually rejuvenate you, to re-energize you. So that could be through creative outlets, through making something physical with your hands, building something, fixing something, going someplace, uh, walking, hiking, hunting, fishing, whatever it might be. But plan it, or it's already planned for you. So that theology of rest, that's given to us, but we have to steward that rest responsibility so that it actually works for the purpose that God intends it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a good point there at the end about the planning of it too. Even just, yeah, like go, well, like you said, whatever, go play a musical instrument or just relax. And yeah,
Yeah.
don't scroll on your phone for an hour, because that's so true.
Yeah, and Lucas, and I don't want to be too negative about digital things,
Yeah.
um, but there is something to be said about leaving a mark on the world, like actually doing something physically, using your body. So I know, some people are more into gaming than others, and there's probably a place for that. But uh, that's pretty hard to, got to be careful from all kinds of hate mail, but that's pretty hard to say, look what I've accomplished, look what I've done, look, so there's a place for that kind of, perhaps that kind of interaction. I love playing games like card games with friends. And if there's an interactive element, that's kind of a redeeming grace to that kind of thing. But being able to say, look what I did in my 4 hours off, bringing sort of a work-like element into work, provided that it's actually refreshing and a benefit to others as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's kind of two things there, I guess, because if I were to say, like, okay, how am I spending my free time? Well, if I'm working on a project around the house, well, then when I'm done, okay, look, I can stand back and say, look, I built a chicken coop. Awesome. Okay, the
Mhm.
chicken coop's right there. Versus I hung around and played guitar for 2 hours. Well, at the end, I don't have anything to look at. It was enjoyable and I had a nice
Yeah.
time. And maybe I have an increased skill set, perhaps. My picking's
Absolutely.
improved. But not, I'm not a big gamer, but just to defend those who do that, I guess there is a bit of a mental element as well. And I think there's, depending on the game, depending on the interaction, I think there's some sharpening going on there
Well,
too.
and then it also you have to ask, is there balance here?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
if you like to game, that may be part of your leisure,
yeah.
but it probably shouldn't be all of your leisure,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so think about balance. Think about your head. What you're filling your head with, how you're using your hands, what you're doing with your heart. All of those things should be part of our leisure activity as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is probably a subject for another podcast, but you've mentioned Cal Newport a number of times, and this
Yeah.
idea of deep work and whatnot too. I think the concept of being stewardly with your time closely ties in with doing a good job in your occupation and fulfilling your vocation, um, up to glorify God in a spirit of thankfulness. Just so we have a practical idea of what that looks like, just a brief taste. Do you structure your day pretty rigidly to block out certain chunks of time for deep work, or how does that work for someone like yourself in your
Well,
context?
I have, and I do. I don't always do it as well as I would like to. Um, but so it's more my week. I mean, I try to do some writing on Monday, and then some writing on Friday, and then midweek I'm majority of what I do is prepare for Sunday services, and so um, but I have found over the years that it is that concentrated time. If you can block off an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours to get something done, turn off your notifications, and I definitely need to do that more. But I think that's where you're really getting something accomplished. We're not made to be distracted, and you lose focus and concentration, and so it's certainly something that's going to help most of us.
Mm-hmm, for sure. Okay, real quick, I'm gonna tie together two things at the end that I kind of wanted to touch on, because that's the chapter 9 there is about managing your money wisely. So you touch on, and of course that relates to your vocation. You touch on retirement a little bit in this section, I believe, as well, and you also talk about profit and debt. Do you want to just give a real quick 101 on what this chapter is about, and tying into that, planning for your future, saving for retirement? How should Christians think about retirement? And yeah, is it just this open chunk of time to do whatever you want? Should we be aiming to retire early? Should you never want to retire? I'm interested to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, Dave Bonson in his book Full Time says, um, one of the thing we're trying to resist here, we ought to resist as Christians, is saying that the most important thing about work is doing it so that we no longer have to do it. That's not a
Mm,
good outlook on life. So we are called to be producers, and we we are always, as long as we have something to give, we should be giving. And that certainly doesn't mean that we're going to be working at the same job until we're 85, or certainly not in the same way. But we do notice today sort of this idea of, that's pretty foreign to most of history, of sort of living for retirement. And that's going to shade how you work as well. You're just sort of checking days off the calendar. And that's not going to contribute to a pursuit of excellence. But more than that, in our older years, we have accumulated knowledge and experience and skills that are so vital to pass on to the next generation, whether it's the in the occupation that we started out in, or if we enter into something else, if we use it in service. But we should not, the Lord has not given our older years to be a permanent vacation. I'm convinced of that. And so you're going to have more freedom. You're going to be able to travel more, perhaps. You might have children in different parts of the country that you're going to spend time with. But we need older people to be committed to serving and to contributing. And so that's what I want to encourage young people. So don't spoil your work years by thinking, I I only have to do this for another 30 years or whatever it is. That's not the right outlook on life. And when you get into wealth, Lucas, you might, some people think about this as an unspiritual topic, but I alluded to earlier, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28, Paul says, "Let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with anyone in need." And so I think one of the more obvious fruits of work is wealth. You look at Acts chapter 4, where the apostles, where the people in the church who had land and homes were able to use their resources to help those who were in need. And so, we should not look at wealth as an unspiritual topic. It is not viewed negatively in Scripture. There are certain hazards associated with the pursuit of wealth. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, Paul says. And we could use wealth for inappropriate means. We could be selfish with our wealth. We could neglect our family in the accumulation of wealth. So there are absolutely hazards, but wealth is a virtue. And I mentioned in the book that if it wasn't for the way that people mishandle wealth, it would be obvious that wealth is a virtue. It's certainly superior to poverty. You wouldn't choose poverty if you had the option. You'd choose wealth. And so we want to view wealth as a good thing. We want to view economies as a good thing. The fact that countries in which a high view of vocation is promoted, they're growing countries and they're able to provide for people well. People are flourishing in these countries. There's, America, for example, because of the Protestant work ethic that we've inherited, could just about feed the world if we needed to. I mean, it's just we want to have a right view of wealth, and young people should as well. Don't get a job just to gain wealth, but think, if I'm productive, if I'm disciplined, if I bring to the table what I need to bring to be rewarded, I'm going to be rewarded. Now, how do I use that wealth properly? So I just talk about basic things. Some of this will be maybe simple for people who have a knack for saving and investing, but statistically, that's not enough people. There are a lot of people who just aren't doing it. The fact that I mentioned in the book, a $400 emergency would be almost a catastrophe for most Americans is not good. We should have a plan for saving. We should have a plan to resist debt. Debt is in most cases a signal of discontent and impatience and an unwillingness to accumulate the wealth we need to buy the things that we want to buy. So resist debt and start thinking about investing early. And I'm not able to give particular investment advice, but I know I thought about saving as a young person. I saved quite a lot as a young person. I was able to buy my first house right after high school. It wasn't a very expensive house, but it's been very good for us. Still own that house. It's a rental property now. The earlier you start with saving and investing, the more benefits there's going to be for you. And so talk to somebody who has some experience in that. But would we not want, and we do see it, don't we, in many Christian countries, is wealthy believers who are able to leverage that wealth for the kingdom of God. And You certainly see it in your community. Even a lot of the tradesmen are unbelievably blessed by the Lord, and they're able to do good not only in their vocation but also finance so many wonderful things even around the world. So start thinking about your financial future as early as possible. As early as possible. It's really never too early to start thinking about what you're going to be doing with the money that you're hopefully going to be earning and are already beginning to earn.
For sure. Yeah, it's just another one of these tools that God gives us to serve others, right? We're doing
That's
it with
right.
our time, and we can do it with our wealth and other resources. Wonderful. Okay. Well, we were definitely at the top of the hour, so to speak, and just want to give you a final chance. Anything you felt like you wanted to cover or leave a final message with people as we kind of wrap things up?
Well, I could go on, Lucas, but this is I appreciate the time that you've given to me. I just want to encourage people. Remember this: you were made to work. You were made uh, to cultivate your little section of the garden that God has given to you, and let's just be blunt. You're going to have to do that anyway. You're just necessity is going to require you to do something with your life. And so I want to encourage young people to think about what the Bible says about work. The Bible, I view the whole Bible as a book about work. It's primarily about the work of God, the Father in creating, and the Son in redeeming, and the Spirit in applying to us the finished work of Jesus Christ. Jesus says, "My Father always works, and I'm working." We've been made to work, and so you're going to have to work. Listen to what God says so that you can be the best kind of worker that you can, to be a blessing to the community around you, to the Lord, and to actually, if you're going to have to work, would you not want to experience the fruit that God has for those who work in the way that He's instructed us to? So, thankful for what you're doing. Appreciate you applying your skills in this particular field and your other field as well, and encouraging people to think about the big question: what am I going to do with my whole life?
Wonderful. Well, we thank you for your time, and yeah, been very appreciative of it. I think I've learned a lot myself, even just reading the book and then following it up with this discussion. So I'd encourage people to check it out. It's Finding My Vocation: A Guide for Young People Seeking a Calling. William Boekestein. Thank you very much, sir. We appreciate it, and hopefully we'll have you on again in the future for a third time.
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you, Lucas. Take care.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Real Talk. In partnership with Reform Perspective, this show is created and produced by Tyler Vanderwood, Lucas Holtfleur, and Mariah Tamiga. We really appreciate you taking the time to listen or watch the show. If you have any feedback for us or ideas for future guests or topics, please let us know. You can reach us at reformedrealtalk@gmail.com. Be sure to also follow us on social media. You can search Reformed Real Talk on any of the platforms. We should come right up. Also, leave us a review, preferably a 5-star one, on any of the podcast platforms. That would be greatly appreciated. That's all for now, folks. Keep having real talk.